Have you ever found yourself like really pondering not just what something is or even how it works, but like the really deep down fundamental why behind it all? Like what makes it the case at the most basic level?
Yeah, totally. It's like that itch to understand.
It really is. And it's something that Aristotle actually nailed way back when. He said, all human beings by nature desire to know. It's like this desire to understand the deepest reasons for things. It just feels, I don't know, almost wired into us?
Oh, absolutely. And that curiosity, right? It's not satisfied with just surface level stuff.
Mhm.
It pushes us to look for these explanations that go way beyond what we get from science or even math.
Right, right. It's a different kind of explanation.
Exactly, into the realm of what we call metaphysical explanation.
Okay, there it is. Metaphysical explanation. I love it. But, for our listeners, let's unpack that a bit. So we're not talking about like lab experiments or wrestling with equations here. What does it actually mean to, I guess, act as philosophers seeking these deeper explanations?
Well, at its core, I think it's about trying to understand the very structure of reality itself. We're digging for those underlying principles, the things that make things the way they are, not just describing them. You know what I
Well,
mean?
yeah, yeah. It's like getting to the essence of why.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on metaphysical explanation. It's a great resource, really lays out the landscape.
Perfect. So our mission, if you will, is to get a good grasp on what metaphysical explanation actually is.
Yeah, explore what it is, the different flavors it comes in, and some of the big debates surrounding it.
It's like we're giving everyone a crash course in, well, metaphysics.
Right, specifically on this idea of explanation. And the entry actually gives us some pretty fascinating places to start. So consider this. Socrates and a bust of Socrates. They both have snub noses, right?
Okay, yeah.
A metaphysical explanation might say that this is because they both share the property of being snub-nosed. It's
Yeah.
like this common underlying thing. Or think about Socrates' cloak. Why is it colored? Because it's specifically green.
Oh, okay. I see where you're going.
Even the idea that Socrates is who he is because of his father, or that he's just because his soul is well ordered, these are all attempts, in a way, at metaphysical explanation. They're looking for those deeper connections.
Yeah, I'm starting to see it. It's about those underlying reasons, not just stating the obvious, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not just that Socrates has a dad, it's about how that fact connects to his very identity.
Exactly. And the source does a great job of highlighting how these explanations often bring up some really core metaphysical distinctions.
Like, what kinds of distinctions? I'm curious.
Well, for instance, you have the relationship between a property and the thing that had that property.
Right.
We call that the property instance distinction.
Okay, so snub-nosedness is the property, and Socrates or the bust are the instances.
You got it.
Yeah.
Then you have the difference between, say, a general characteristic and a specific version of it. Like color is the general and green is the specific.
That's the determinate thing, right?
Yep, you know your stuff. And then there's the classic essence-accident distinction. What's essential to something versus what's just an accidental feature.
Right, like maybe Socrates' intelligence was essential to him being Socrates, but the fact that he had a beard was just, well, an accident of history.
Exactly. And finally, you have the distinction between what's doing the explaining, the analysans, and what's being explained, the analysandum.
That's a mouthful.
It is. But these are really like the fundamental building blocks we use when we're thinking philosophically, especially when it comes to these kinds of deeper explanations.
Got it. So we've got these basic tools in our philosophy toolkit, but now we need to figure out how to actually use them. And I think one of the first big questions that comes up is how this kind of why, this metaphysical why, is different from the everyday why we use when we're talking about cause and effect. You know what I mean? Like the sun came out, therefore the puddle evaporated.
That is the crucial question to start with. It's all about understanding that difference.
Yeah.
So let's think about that puddle evaporating. You're right. The sun comes out, the heat warms the water, and that causes it to evaporate. That's a classic cause and effect explanation. One event leads to another over time.
Yeah, a classic chain reaction.
Exactly. But metaphysical explanations, they don't really work like that. They're not about these sequences of events.
So it's not like dominoes falling one after the other.
Not quite. It's more about a state of affairs at a particular moment. Let's go back to Socrates and that snub-nosed bust.
Okay, yeah.
The fact that they both have a snub nose, it's not caused by the property of snub-nosedness. It's not like the property came first and then made them have snub noses.
Right, it's not like the property is some kind of force acting on them.
Exactly. It's a relationship that exists simultaneously. It's what we call synchronic, happening at the same time,
Yeah.
rather than diachronic, happening over time.
So it's less about a before and after and more about a state of being at a single point in time.
You got it.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm also thinking, maybe not all explanations fit neatly into these two categories, right? Like, what about mathematical explanations? They don't seem causal in the typical sense.
That's a great point. You're right. Metaphysical explanation isn't the only type of non-causal explanation out there. Math is a perfect example.
Hmm.
But what's interesting is that even when we're doing math, metaphysical ideas might still be lurking in the background.
Oh, that's interesting. So, like, even though we're not explicitly talking about metaphysics, it could still be influencing how those explanations work.
Exactly. And it also raises the question, right, of whether metaphysical explanations have to be completely separate from cause and effect. I mean, it seems like there could be some overlap.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like, what if the explanation itself involves some kind of causal process?
That's a really good point. And the source actually brings up an example that gets at this. Think about the statement. Socrates is in pain because the functional role of pain is realized by C fibers firing in his brain.
Okay, so we've got the C fibers firing, which is definitely a causal process leading to the sensation of pain.
Right. So the thing doing the explaining in this case, those firing C fibers, involves a cause and effect sequence. And the explanandum, the thing being explained, which is Socrates being in pain, well, that's also often understood in terms of its causal effects. But the key here is that the relationship between that functional role of pain and its physical realization in the brain isn't itself a causal one.
Right. It's more about how one thing is implemented by the other, how one thing gives rise to the other, not in a temporal sense, but in a more fundamental way.
Exactly. It's about constitution or realization, not about one thing making another thing happen in a sequential way. So the big takeaway is that while metaphysical explanations might not be causal at their core, they can definitely involve causal elements. It's about the nature of the relationship that's key.
I see. So even if cause and effect are part of the picture, the connection between those things in a metaphysical explanation is different. It's non-causal. That's subtle, but I think it's really important to get that when you're thinking philosophically.
Totally. It's one of those distinctions that can really trip people up.
It can. Now, I'm also wondering, what about this idea of metaphysical causation? The source mentions A. Wilson and his argument that grounding itself might actually be a kind of causation, just operating at a more, well, metaphysical level.
Right. It's a fascinating, though definitely debated idea, and it kind of blurs those lines we've been drawing. The Wilson's point is that grounding, with its directionality and the way one thing depends on another, it really mirrors causation. It's just that it's happening at a more fundamental level of reality.
Yeah, it's like causation, but for metaphysics.
And then there's Bennett, who suggests that even regular causation, the kind we see in the everyday world, could actually be a form of metaphysical building.
Metaphysical building? What does that even mean?
Well, it's the idea that causation is, at its core, a way of putting things together metaphysically. So it's like even regular causation could be seen as part of this bigger picture of metaphysical explanation.
Wow. So the boundaries get really fuzzy here, don't they? It seems like even defining what counts as metaphysical versus causal is something philosophers are still actively figuring out.
Absolutely. It's an evolving conversation for sure.
It is, but I think the point the source makes about focusing on how these explanations function, especially those non-causal ones, that's really helpful. It's about understanding the mechanisms, even if the labels are a bit messy.
Yeah, the labels can be tricky, but the underlying ideas, those are what matter.
They do. Okay, so we've got a better handle on how metaphysical explanation is different from the causal kind, or at least how it's usually different.
Right, some good starting point.
Exactly. But now let's dive into some of the types of metaphysical explanation that the source lays out. It starts with this classic argument for properties based on objective resemblances. I'm curious to hear more about that. What's the basic philosophical thinking there?
Yeah, so this argument really gets at this puzzle of why different things in the world share similarities.
Like, why do some things look alike even though they're clearly different things?
Exactly. So think about our friend Socrates and the bust again.
Oh no, not them again.
I know. But they're helpful for this.
Yeah.
So they both have snub noses, but what makes that similarity possible? It can't just be pure coincidence, right?
Yeah, there's got to be something more to it than that.
That's where properties come in. The idea is that there are these abstract entities, these properties that exist out there in the world, and different things can share these properties.
So they're both snub-nosed because they both have this property of being snub-nosed. It's like a shared characteristic.
You got it. And this sharing of a property is what metaphysically explains their objective resemblance. It's not just that they happen to look similar, it's that they have this common underlying feature.
Okay, that makes sense. But of course, the big philosophical debate is whether these properties actually exist, right? Like, are they real things out in the world, or are they just something our minds make up to categorize things?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the source acknowledges that it's a whole other can of worms. But even if we accept that properties play this role, the next question is what kind of metaphysical explanation is at work here?
Right, like how does this property stuff actually explain anything?
That's where the source gets really interesting. It introduces three main varieties of metaphysical explanation that have been kind of central to recent debates in philosophy.
Okay, I'm all ears. Hit me with number one.
All right, the first one is grounding explanation. This is all about the idea that more fundamental facts give rise to less fundamental ones.
Give rise to, that's an interesting way to put it.
It is. And philosophers often use phrases like in virtue of, or because, or makes it the case that to talk about grounding. So our Socrates and bust example could be seen as a grounding explanation. The fact that they both instantiate the property of being snub-nosed grounds the fact that they resemble each other in that specific way.
So the shared property is more fundamental than the resemblance itself. Like it's what makes them resemble each other.
That's the gist.
Yeah.
And this points to a kind of hierarchy in reality, right? Some truths are more basic and they determine other truths. It's like a metaphysical building process.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
And you remember that example of the cloak being colored because it's green?
Yeah, yeah.
That's another instance of grounding. Color is the more general determinable property, and green is this specific determinate property. So the greenness of the cloak grounds the fact that it has a color at all.
Right. Greenness is the more fundamental fact in that case.
Exactly. And the source also makes this interesting point that grounding explanations don't always have to explicitly state the grounds. Like sometimes just giving information about the grounds is enough. They modify the Socrates example and say that Socrates and the bust are snub-nosed because they share some property or other.
So we don't know exactly which property it is, but we know that there is some shared property that's doing the explaining.
Right. And that's still a form of grounding explanation, even if we don't have all the details. It's like saying this effect has a cause, even if I don't know exactly what that cause is.
Okay, I get it. So that's grounding, the more fundamental stuff giving rise to the less fundamental stuff. What's the second kind of metaphysical explanation?
So the second kind is essentialist explanation. This one works by pointing to something that's part of what it is to be some phenomenon.
So it's about what makes something that thing and not something else, like what's in its DNA, so to speak.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
And the source uses the example of Socrates being who he is, at least in part because he had Sophroniscus as his father.
Okay, yeah. So having Sophroniscus as his father is part of Socrates' essence. It's like a defining feature.
That's the idea. And the source draws a contrast here between grounding and essence, which I think is really important. So grounding is often seen as being modally sufficient, but not necessarily necessary.
Hold on. Modally sufficient and necessary. We're getting a bit technical here. Can you break that down for me?
Sure. So modally refers to possibility, to all the ways things could be. And sufficient means that if the grounding facts are true, then the grounded fact has to be true in that possible world. It couldn't be any other way.
Okay. So if the ground is there, the thing being grounded is automatically there too.
Right. But grounding isn't always necessary. It could be that the grounded fact is true in other possible worlds, even if those specific grounding facts aren't true. There might be other ways to get there.
Okay, so it's like if A, then B, but not necessarily only if A, then B. There could be other ways to get to B.
You got it. Now, essence is different. It's often seen as being modally necessary, but not necessarily sufficient.
So with essence, it's more like if it's B, then it must have A.
Exactly. Like for Socrates to be Socrates, he must have certain essential properties. But those properties alone might not be enough to pinpoint him uniquely. There might be other things out there with those same properties that aren't Socrates.
Right. It's like those essential properties are necessary, but they might not be the whole story.
Precisely. So the focus with essentialist explanation is really on necessity, on what makes something that thing in all possible worlds.
It's about its core identity, its blueprint, in a way.
Exactly. And even though the source mentions that some philosophers are trying to figure out if we can understand grounding through essence or the other way around, for now we're treating them as separate, distinct types of explanation.
Okay, so we've got grounding, which is about more fundamental facts giving rise to less fundamental facts, and we've got essentialist explanation, which is about what makes something that thing in all possible worlds. What's the third one?
All right. The third type of metaphysical explanation is reductive explanation. And this one's all about analysis. It's about
Hmm.
breaking down a phenomenon and showing that it's really nothing more than something else.
Nothing more than, sounds like we're simplifying things.
In a way, yes. It's like taking something complex and showing that it's really just a specific configuration of something more basic. And the example the source gives is Socrates being just because his soul is well ordered.
Okay, so being just, in this view, isn't some separate, independent quality that Socrates has. It's just a result of his soul being in a particular state.
That's the idea. It's like saying that justice, when it comes to Socrates, is really just a particular manifestation of a well-ordered soul. It's reducing one concept to another.
So it's like saying that water is nothing more than two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom bonded together.
Exactly. And just like with grounding and essence, there's debate about whether we can understand reduction in terms of those other two, like maybe being just is grounded in having a well-ordered soul, or maybe having a well-ordered soul is part of the essence of a just person. But for our purposes, we're keeping reduction as a distinct type of metaphysical explanation.
Got it. So we've got these three big players: grounding, essentialist, and reductive explanation. But the source also hints that there might be other forms out there.
Yeah, it does. It gives this example of Socrates having Sophroniscus as a father,
Hmm.
because he essentially has Sophroniscus as a father.
Okay. But we already talked about essence, right? How is this different?
So remember how in the earlier essentialist example, having Sophroniscus as a father was part of what it is to be Socrates.
Yeah.
In this new example, it's not explaining Socrates' being at all. It's explaining why he has a certain property, having Sophroniscus as his father, by appealing to the status of that property. The status being that it's an essential property of Socrates.
It's like we're explaining a feature of Socrates by pointing to the fact that that feature is essential to him.
Exactly. And it gets into these really subtle distinctions about modal strength, about the levels of necessity involved.
Right. It's not just that Socrates has a father. It's about the particular kind of relationship he has with that father, a necessary relationship.
And the source mentions other possibilities too, like explanations that appeal to fundamental metaphysical laws, or even just to the sheer necessity of a certain fact. So there are a lot of different ways we try to explain things by pointing to some kind of deep underlying status or connection.
So it's like a whole toolbox of metaphysical because claims.
It really is. And the source makes it clear that this isn't an exhaustive list. Like, philosophers are still actively debating the validity and the distinctness of all these different forms.
It's an ongoing project, for sure.
It is. And I think that leads us to a really interesting tension that the source brings up. This idea that metaphysical explanations, they seem to be both about the objective world out there and about how we, as thinkers, understand and communicate about it.
It's like they have one foot in objective truth and the other foot in our subjective experience of trying to make sense of that truth.
You nailed it. On one hand, we want to say that these explanations are about the structure of reality, about those non-causal relationships that exist out there in the world, regardless of what we think.
Right. It's not just our opinion. It's about how things really are.
Exactly. But at the same time, they're explanations, which means they have to be intelligible to us. They have to connect with our cognitive capacities, our ability to understand.
So it's not just about the cold, hard facts. It's also about how those facts make sense to us.
Right. So the challenge is to figure out how to reconcile these two aspects, how to bridge the gap between objective reality and our subjective grasp of it.
It's a balancing act for sure. And how do different philosophical views approach this challenge?
Well, the source focuses specifically on grounding and introduces two main camps: unionism and separatism.
Okay, unionism versus separatism. Lay it on me.
So unionism says that grounding is metaphysical explanation. Like, to say that one fact grounds another fact is just another way of saying that the first fact explains the second fact. It's a package deal.
So there's no real distinction between the grounding relation itself and the explanation. They're one and the same.
That's the basic idea. And the source mentions philosophers like Desgupta, Jenkins, Raven, and Rosen who hold this view.
Okay, so for a unionist, when I say the shirt is green because it's emerald, I'm not just describing a relationship between two facts out there in the world. I'm actually giving an explanation.
Exactly. The grounding relation itself is doing the explanatory work.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the unionist has to explain how this objective relationship out in the world connects with our subjective understanding, how it becomes intelligible to us.
Right, because it can't just be a brute fact out there. We have to be able to grasp it somehow.
Exactly. Now, separatism takes a different approach. It says that grounding and grounding explanation are two separate things. Grounding is this objective relationship that holds in the world, but an explanation is something else.
Something else, like what?
Well, it could be a statement, a piece of discourse, a mental act of making something intelligible. There are different views on what exactly an explanation is, but the key is that it's not the same thing as the grounding relation itself.
Okay, so the grounding relation is like the raw material, and the explanation is how we process and present that raw material.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
But even though separatists distinguish these two things, they still believe that explanations are backed or tracked by instances of grounding in the world. Like there has to be a real grounding relation out there for the explanation to be, well, about something.
Makes sense. So a separatist would say that the grounding relation between greenness and the emerald shirt provides the objective basis for my explanation, but the explanation itself is something separate, something I construct to make sense of that relationship.
Exactly. And philosophers like Audi, Schaeffer, and Trogdon are often associated with this view.
Okay, so both views have their challenges, right? The unionist has to explain how an objective relation becomes subjectively intelligible, and the separatist has to explain how explanations track grounding relations, how they stay connected to the real world.
You got it. And the source points out that separatists who focus on causal explanation face a similar challenge, explaining how causal explanations relate to actual causal relations. But it's even trickier for metaphysical explanation, because we're dealing with these non-causal relations.
Right. It's not as straightforward as saying this event caused that event. We're dealing with a different kind of connection altogether.
Exactly.
Now, I'm also wondering, does this unionism versus separatism debate apply neatly to all types of metaphysical explanation? Like, we talked about essentialist and reductive explanations too. Does it get more complicated when we consider those?
Yeah, good question. I mean, if you think essentialist explanations are about relationships between things that aren't facts, like the essential properties of an object,
Yeah.
then it's not as simple as saying they're equivalent to a grounding relation between facts.
Right. Essence seems to be operating at a different level than just facts about the world.
Exactly. And then there's the question of what these non-causal relations are ultimately tracking. Like, if grounding tracks part-whole relations or determinable relations, what's the explanation really pointing to? The grounding relation itself or the relation that grounding is based on?
It's layers upon layers, isn't it?
It is, and for separatists, it gets even more complex. They have to clarify what their explanations are actually tracking.
It's enough to make your head spin. But I think this whole debate really highlights a key challenge in philosophy, the struggle to bridge the gap between what's out there in the world and how we make sense of it. It's like trying to build a bridge between two different universes.
I like that analogy. It's about finding a way to connect those two realms.
Exactly. And speaking of connecting things, I think this leads nicely to another fundamental question. Is metaphysical explanation a single unified thing? Or are there multiple different kinds of metaphysical because at play?
Right. That's the monism versus pluralism debate. Like, are we doing one basic kind of thing when we offer these explanations? Or are there many different ways to explain things metaphysically?
Yeah, and how do we even begin to answer that?
Well, as the source points out, it's not just about the number of metaphysical relations out there, but also about how we use those relations to explain things. Like, you could think there are many different kinds of metaphysical relations, but still think they all work in the same basic way when it comes to explanation. Or you could think there's just one fundamental relation, like grounding, but that grounding explanations themselves can take different forms or serve different purposes.
So it's like even if the ingredients are the same, the recipe can be different.
Exactly, and this adds a whole other layer of complexity to the debate.
It does.
And to make things even more complicated, the source brings up this distinction between how explanation and why explanation.
Okay, now we're adding even more categories. What's the difference between those two?
So, how explanations? They aim to tell you the specific way something is the case, the step-by-step process. Why explanations, on the other hand, aim to give you the fundamental reason why it's the case at all. It's about the underlying cause, or the ultimate principle.
So a how question is like, how do you make a cake? And a why question is like, why does this cake exist in the first place?
Exactly. And the existence of these different types of questions might suggest that we need different kinds of metaphysical explanation to answer them.
Right, because the kind of answer that satisfies a how question isn't going to cut it for a why question.
Right. And then there's Bertrand's idea of explanation by constraint. That's a kind of top-down explanation that shows how a particular thing fits into a larger framework or principle.
So it's less about finding a direct cause for something and more about showing how it's a necessary part of a bigger system.
Exactly. It's about seeing the forest for the trees.
I like that. But doesn't that run into problems when it comes to explaining, say, unique events or individuals? Like, if everything is explained by how it fits into a big system, how do we account for the things that stand out, the things that are one of a kind?
That's a good point. And it's something that proponents of explanation by constraint need to address. But even if we accept these different categories of explanation, the monists could still argue that they're just different ways of probing for the same underlying kind of explanation.
So it's like, even though we ask different kinds of questions, maybe we're always looking for the same basic kind of answer.
That's their argument. They might say that our ways of asking vary, but the fundamental nature of metaphysical explanation is singular. It's just applied in different ways depending on the context.
Okay, so the monism versus pluralism debate is really about whether the diversity we see in our metaphysical explanations is superficial or whether it reflects something deeper about the nature of explanation itself.
You got it. It's a debate about unity versus diversity at the most fundamental level.
And speaking of fundamental questions, I think that leads us to another big one. How objective is metaphysical explanation? Like, when we give an explanation, are we pointing to something truly out there in the world, regardless of whether we happen to think about it? Or is it more about our own human ways of understanding and communicating?
The realism versus anti-realism debate. Always a fun one.
It's a classic. So, on the one hand, we have the realists who think that what metaphysically explains what is just a fact about the world. It's out there, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. And for strong realists, those metaphysical explanations might just be those mind-independent relations that hold in reality. It's like the explanation is the relationship itself.
So for them, it doesn't matter if any human ever comes along to think about it or articulate it, the explanation is still there doing its thing.
Right. It's built into the fabric of reality.
But even most realists acknowledge that there's usually a representational component to explanation, right? Like, we have to use language and concepts to formulate these explanations.
Yeah, that's true. We can't just point at the world and say, there's the explanation.
Mhm.
We have to express it somehow. But for the realist, as long as the worldly component is objective, that's what really matters.
Okay, so it's about capturing that objective reality in our explanations, even if we can't perfectly mirror it.
Exactly. It's about getting as close to the truth as we can with our limited human tools.
But what about those less than fully realist views? Like, the source mentions this idea that our cognitive abilities might play a bigger role in what counts as a good explanation.
Right. You could argue that even if there's an objective grounding relation out there, our ability to understand that relation matters. Like, if the explanation is so complex or convoluted that we can't wrap our minds around it, it's not really doing much explaining for us.
It's like the explanation might be objectively true, but if it's completely unintelligible to us, it's not really doing its job.
Exactly. And that brings in this element of human judgment, human understanding, which makes the explanation itself at least partly mind-dependent.
So it's not just about the objective facts anymore. It's also about our ability to grasp those facts.
Right. It's a bit of a hybrid view.
It is. And how do realists respond to that kind of challenge?
Well, one way is to draw a distinction between the explanation itself, which is that objective relation, and the act of explaining, which is our human attempt to understand and articulate that relation.
So it's like the explanation is out there doing its thing, but our success in grasping it or communicating it, that's another matter.
Exactly. Or they might say that as long as the fundamental component, the worldly relation, is objective, then that's enough to call it a metaphysical explanation, regardless of how well we understand it.
Okay, so realists have ways to defend their view. What about the anti-realists? Where do they stand on all this?